podcast. My name is John. Every week I'll be joined by my co-host Mir, and together we're starting this podcast to dive deeper into what makes Arabia tick. Every week we'll have a big, bold question that we attempt to unravel using real independent data from the region. We'll explore what's in the news and what has perhaps slipped under the radar of public consciousness.
So kicking things off, we're exploring technology in life, how it impacts people in the UAE, and also kind of look at some interesting data from around the world and see how people are navigating this turbulent environment.
So in our first week, we asked YouGov to ask 1,000 people a big, bold question. We asked people from Abu Dhabi through to Dubai and all across the Emirates, everywhere in between. Do you think it's become more difficult to separate work and personal life due to technology since 2020? The key there is the due to technology. It's a big one. I mean, naturally you'd think yes, but let's have a look at what the poll said. So the answer was 70% of people, so 7 in 10 people in the UAE think it's become more difficult to separate work and personal life due to technology since 2020. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. When I saw the data, I was quite blown away because you see quite a lot of news in terms of happiness index, different initiatives. And I guess the kind of few key questions that I have, and I think I want to explore this a bit more, is it the responsibility of the individual to manage their work and life balance, right? Is it the responsibility of the employer? Should they have checks, balances, policies in place to be able to ensure work-life balance? Should the government play a role in terms of what is allowed and how people, because obviously they need to ensure the well-being of its citizens and residents? And is really technology the culprit here? And kind of dive a bit deeper into that double-edged sword. Because I think work-life balance is not something new, the key word being technology, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So as early as the 70s, 60s, 80s, people were talking about the psychological effects of people bring your work to home. And yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. So let's dive into that.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think people do find it hard then to separate their work and home life due to technology? What are the things that you think are the most likely culprits? I mean, I would kick things off by saying I always find it difficult to separate things when I'm on WhatsApp. When I'm sitting there and I've got a message from a client and it's 7 o'clock at night, or maybe 8 o'clock at night. At what point do you switch your phone off? Does anybody ever switch their phone off? Of course not. None of us do. We sit there on our phones the whole day long. We're scrolling through stuff incessantly. And it's natural that if you've got your phone in front of you and it just happens to be work, you start doing work in the evening as well, or maybe it's early in the morning. Maybe it's, you're with family, and perhaps you're at an event. What kind of event would you switch your phone off for or turn off from work? If you're at a wedding, do you decide I'm going to not look at my phone and check my emails from work? And do you know what? I bet most people would. They'd still look at their emails. They'd still scroll through it, and they'd be at a big family event, and they'd just be scrolling through their emails.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's quite interesting. There was a research report out of Scotland, and this is 2022. The most commonly cited situations for checking work messages were first thing in the morning, 93%. So, a lot of people say that's probably the worst thing to do, to reach for your phone as soon as you wake up. But 93%, 89% in the evenings, and 81% on days off. So even on their days off, they're checking their messages. Kind of some qualitative, interesting things that popped out for me was the positive. Technology has enabled them to work more flexibly, and that's of most value to them. So being able to work from anywhere at any time is actually, they find it better and more positive for them. And they even cited it being better than a £5,000 wage increase. So the use of technology is obviously better. Another indicated that it's not the technology that leads to problems, but personal attitudes and self-control. And then another
100%. It's all down to the individual, isn't it? It's not the technology is not forcing us to do anything.
Yeah.
We're not being forced by technology to do half of these things and check our emails or respond to things. It's how we interact with people and that communication and setting boundaries. But then the question arises, is it the individual's responsibility to set those boundaries, or is it their work? Is it the culture within their business that they're working for that really dictates whether those employees decide? And you look across different businesses, big companies to small companies, and it kind of comes from the top. Does that individual turn up and start messaging you at 6 a.m? Do they message you at 10 at night? And I'm sure that there's an awful lot of people who've got bosses who overstep those boundaries.
Yeah.
And as company co-founder, I'd like to think that I don't overstep, but it'd be interesting to know if I do sometimes.
Yeah. So I think also some interesting, I don't know if you saw this, bait.com did a survey. It was earlier this year in October. Over half of the employees in the region have considered leaving their current job to find better work-life balance in the past 12 months. So I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with what we found when we surveyed the UAE. This is obviously a regional survey looking at the MENA region. 84% of survey respondents in that survey said that their leadership respects their time and work-life balance. And 91% say that they have time to exercise and take care of their health. So there's clearly kind of, I think also the definition of what is a healthy work-life balance, right? So I think it's down to education, number one. I think it's also how are we using technology? And like you said, a lot of people just don't know the tools. Kind of one of the biggest problems that a lot of CIOs in large organizations have cited when on the onset of pandemic and implementing these different tools that allow hybrid working, flexibility, productivity, is the lack of training provided to individuals to maximize the features and to efficiently use these technologies. So for example, the iPhone, right? And that's kind of, it's always in your pocket, therefore it's always on. You always see these notifications, whether they're work, personal, emails, etc. And then the number of different apps, right? You can Zoom you can use Teams, you can use Slack. But then iPhone with their update took out those 4 different modes, which is work, do not disturb, sleep, right? How many people really know how to program that to make sure that they're not seeing those notifications in their personal time or when they've deemed that they need to switch off? So I think there's a lot of education and training also required from employers for their employees to maximize the use of the different technologies and tools that are provided to them to be productive, efficient, and happy employees.
But it's interesting, isn't it, that you mentioned a number of different channels there that people are using. And isn't that an interesting thing in itself? Because there's so many different messaging options, so many different ways of communicating with each other. Is it emails? Is it Slack? Is it Trello? Is it WhatsApp? How much time is actually being wasted by messaging rather than actually doing what you need to do for the job? How much of it is done, in the workday? How much is spent just sending messages to people, to communicate, to update people on what's going on? Because somebody hasn't checked their Trello or the Slack or the email, and they need to WhatsApp them because somebody hasn't replied within the 10 minutes that they think that they should be responding in. I imagine there's enormous amounts of time that are spent wasted sending unnecessary messages across all of these different channels. And the negatives of that, I can imagine if you're constantly doing this, you start thinking negatively of your fellow employees if they're not responding quickly. If you send something at 7 o'clock at night and your expectation is that your fellow colleague should be replying at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night because you're working and you haven't had the opportunity to switch off, you're still stuck in the office, but they've decided to go down and have a drink with their mates instead of staying in the office late. So you start pestering them, and then it becomes, where do you draw that boundary? And I think there's a lot of negatives with that. You get more tired, you're stressed. You probably don't go to the gym as much because you're constantly sending messages to people instead. I think it's probably a big negative impact on relationships as well. if you're the kind of person who doesn't switch off from work, you're probably the kind of person who maybe is rubbing up the wrong way with your spouse or your partner, because you're not able to differentiate in that moment in time between whether you should be spending time and quality time and the value of that quality time with your partner, instead of responding to that work email, or because your boss has told you that you needed to jump on something. One of the interesting things that also came out from this was it was felt more strongly. So this survey with YouGov being more difficult to separate work and personal life due to technology since 2020, it was felt more strongly by men than women. Why would that be? There was a 5 to 10% differentiation here in the percentage. So, this is quite a significant difference between men and women. Men are finding it far more difficult to separate work and personal life due to technology than women. Is there something? Are women better at balancing their work and their personal life?
I mean, it's a great question.
My natural thing is I think women are generally more organised than men. I think a lot of women are very, very organised. Just naturally, how I've seen things with personal life and in workplace as well. I think women are very organised. I think being more organised, it's probably maybe slightly easier to balance that and understand things. The other aspect on this is that we dig into the figures a bit deeper. This feeling was felt strongest amongst married people versus singles. So single people were, perhaps happier in terms of balancing that technology with their work and personal life, possibly because they didn't have the same pressures on their personal life. Maybe spending a lot of time in work, maybe their obsession was work, and that's why they're single. It's a big moment in time, isn't it, 2020? A lot of things happened, and particularly recovering from a pandemic, you have that mode where a lot of businesses are putting pressure on people. There's more pressure on individuals to perhaps contribute more to their businesses than they did before. Perhaps people have been let go from their businesses and it's still in that recovery phase. You never know, you might be covering 2 or even 3 people's job responsibilities. So therefore, inevitably, you're going to be working more hours. The other aspect from the survey was that it was felt most strongly from people who were earning between 20 and 40,000 dirhams. So that's between $5,500 US a month and $11,000. I don't know why the mid-tier incomes would feel it the most.
Yeah, I think, as you rightfully mentioned, right, that 2020 was a hard year, not only for the world but also within the UAE, right? People were uncertain of how their business was going to be affected. As you mentioned, a lot of people were let go. And typically for a business, even if I was to think as a business owner, it was, who are the kind of high paid employees? How do I get middle tier employees to cover more of the top end work? One of the interesting things that we've seen, and especially if you look at kind of global conversation, you have, the Great Resignation, right? People not
cliche alert,
not wanting to return to what work used to be before the pandemic, right? They want flexibility, they want the same pay, they want to be working from anywhere. I read an article where this person was working 2 jobs and from somewhere else and had hired a freelancer to do their work and meetings for them. And they were like sitting in Bali and doing their work. But again,
fantastic.
As an employer, is that okay? As long as they deliver, right? And
as long as you're transparent.
Yeah, and I think technology. What does, like, if you look at it from and I think we got to bring it back to technology, right? Because work-life balance, I think a lot of people always think when the first thing that comes to their mind is time, right? But it's not, work-life balance is not just about time. It's about where you're working from, when you're working, how many hours you're working, should you be monitored? So if you see like on TikTok, there are a lot of people that are like, hacks for making sure that your Slack mouse keeps moving. So you're shown as active, right?
Whereas, but isn't that crazy? Isn't it crazy that we live in a time where businesses don't trust their employees so much that they need to have tools that monitor whether they're actually working or not. And I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's some jobs that require a set number of hours being done, but an awful lot these days are based upon, surely should be based on results, not clock in, clock out. Oh, you've clocked in at 9 o'clock and you've clocked out at 5 o'clock. Well, good for you. Well done. But you've done absolutely nothing in that time. You've just sat there, perhaps, filling out something unnecessary just to make sure you're there in the allotted hours, and then you clock off and off you go. And you've contributed nothing. What about people who actually can do stuff in the time that it takes them because they are really good at what they do? I'd far rather have somebody in my organisation, our organisation, that could do a job in 4 hours and then go take that time off and play tennis or whatever they want to do at that time. Hit a paddle around. And have a better work-life balance because they're really good at what they do and they're based on the results.
Yeah, but
I'm not saying that somebody should just slack off and not work in those other hours. But if they do, and that surely you should be giving flexibility to people, especially with everything that's happened since 2020.
Yeah.
We live in that time where surely we should have learned lessons from all of this. We've got all this fantastic technology to enable us to save time. Great. Put it to good use. Allow people to have more of a lifestyle, have a better quality of life, because it's only going to deliver better results for businesses. And you look at the direction of travel towards technology, just thinking a little bit into the future. Yes, we've got emails, WhatsApp, Zoom, whatever. But we're moving towards metaverse now as well. What that looks like is still yet to play out, but it's inevitable that we're going to either be doing things more on our computers, our laptops, or headsets, or whatever it is that direction takes. We're going to be finding it harder and harder to differentiate between work and life due to technology. I think it's this figure of 70%. There's a good chance we ask this in a decade from now, and it's maybe even higher.
Yeah,
that's quite a scary thought.
Yeah, and I think and again, the promise of technology for us as a human race was the promise of convenience, of time, of efficiency, of productivity, to allow us to do the things that humans do best, which is be creative and collaborate and create ideas and work on things and really explore passions. And for some reason, if you just kind of go back to that question, the question was very specific. Is, work-life balance due to technology? And 70% of people. So I think it's kind of it's a bigger problem to uncover than just purely the technology. It's the technology is unbiased. I don't think it's there to put people down or to create anxiety and stress. It's just doing what it was programmed or coded to do. And ultimately we're the operators and we're the users and we're the architects of how it plays what role it plays within our world, right?
But then just to pick you up on that a little bit, technology is built so that you spend as much time engaging with that technology as possible. So maybe the technology itself is a partly to blame for how we operate with being used. People, the makers over at WhatsApp and Slack and whatever, they want people on it as much as possible. They want as many businesses using it, as many people using it. It makes sense for them. So possibly there is a deeper answer there when it comes to the technology. Does the technology itself have a responsibility to play in terms of how people use it? You mentioned notifications and all this kind of stuff earlier. So maybe there is a responsibility there for the technology companies to work closer with corporate businesses to work out how they can actually better manage this for their employees. Of course, technology does help us do some amazing things. And I suspect the team over at the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Centre have probably been pulling some long shifts lately. So this part of the podcast, we talk about what's been happening in the news. The UAE has launched the first Arab-built moon rover. It's called the Rashid rover. It's named after the late Sheikh Rashid Al Said. It's going to be doing experiments like analysing plasma and dust on the lunar surface. I tried to find out why you'd be looking at moon dust, why that was going to be interesting for them. Apparently it's something to do with being able to design better spacesuits. Apparently these tiny little bits of moon dust, they're really, really sharp and jagged. So they want to find ways in which spacesuits and the kind of equipment they're going to be taking over to the moon, because this is going to be one of the first missions that they're doing. They're going to be doing more and more. They want to have more of a presence, in space in general. They want to find ways in which this space dust or moon dust doesn't erode these spacesuits and get into them and start causing jags and nicks. And I'm sure that's probably pretty dangerous if you've got an astronaut there and walking around in a spacesuit. You don't want it to be causing lots of issues with what he's wearing or she. The rover's been built by the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, and the lander's been built by a Japanese private company called iSpace, which I think is fantastic because it means Apple have missed out on a name with the I at the start of the word. And the whole goal of all of this is they're going to be targeting missions to Mars in the future. The big target is building something on Mars made by the UAE in the year 2117. It's great news for the UAE, isn't it? It's great news for the whole region that we have Arabia going to the moon.
Yeah, it is really exciting news. And I think around the world, people, well, at least I remember myself as a child, and I think all kids get very excited about being an astronaut and space travel, and there's that element of sci-fi. Kind of one of the questions that I wanted to ask you is it worth the money? Is space exploration really, when you look at cost versus opportunity versus benefit, are there better ways that we could be spending money? I think we have a lot of real world problems that already exist that need to be solved. I kind of wanted to explore that a bit more. I kind of looked at, and obviously most of space programs, space exploration, are publicly funded, right? So they're public funds that are going into these various programs. And it's estimated that the total annual budget of space agencies across the kind of big contributors to this global race to space is around 41.8 billion. NASA is around 19 billion. The Russians spent around 5.6. Then you've got ESA in Europe, and obviously the Chinese, the Japanese, and the French. So I think that's kind of what's really interesting for me, that, what are the real pros and cons of space exploration? Yeah,
I mean, I think in terms of the cost spent, I'm sure those figures seem like massive amounts, but, whether it's public spending or private companies like SpaceX going up into to sort of doing these things, I'm sure there's a big advantage to it. There's rare earth minerals and all this kind of stuff, and it's not only that, but we have this finite space on Earth, and if it's kind of hard to imagine it, but at some point in probably not that far into the future, that land on Earth is going to be really, really difficult to sort of find space. So, what options do you have? You can either start building stuff that floats, which people are starting to do. I've seen buildings and hotels that are being built which are floating. Fantastic things. We've seen Saudi Arabia was announcing its first sort of floating city recently. So that's one option. You can either build upwards with skyscrapers. You can find other parts of the Earth which haven't been landscaped yet, if you like. But at some point in time, it's going to be really difficult to find that space on this planet. So inevitably, we need to start looking somewhere else. The problem for me is that some of the technology is not there yet. I don't think that Mars or the moon is somewhere where people naturally want to be living, because do you want to be living in a dome? Is it that much difference between living in a dome though, and when we're here in the summertime and it's 50 degrees outside, and you've got your AC on? If you wouldn't notice any difference, would you? So possibly, there is that as a future. I just think that when it comes to space travel, it all comes down to what are the advantages for private companies. Inevitably, it's going to be money which shapes the direction of these things. For SpaceX, for a long time, businesses are looking at how to do things. I don't think SpaceX at the moment is anything to do with getting to other planets. I think it's everything to do with launching up Starlink satellites to connect the world, which is a big goal. If you have the ability to control the internet, which is what Starlink could potentially do, or other rivals for that matter, because there are rivals.
Yeah.
That's a huge opportunity for these businesses to connect what's already on the planet. And I think that's really where these initial things are going. It's how can we do things in space which are going to impact this planet? I think that's really the shorter term thing. Long term, yeah, of course, it'd be amazing to go to Mars. Can you imagine? Yeah. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah, but I think it's a lot deeper than that as well. Kind of picking up on that point earlier, kind of the space race, right? Is our eventual imminent escape from Earth due to lack of resources, lack of space, possibly a lack of climate or an environment for the human species to survive. And
so on that, do you think that we should be spending more in terms of turn that $40 billion or whatever it is into protecting this planet right now?
And that begs the question, right? And I think there's a deeper debate in terms of who gets to escape? How much does that cost? If you look at kind of regional migration, the global south getting on dinghy boats, trying to get to the shores of Europe, how is that being handled? International tensions, rightfully, like you said, right? If I just kind of think back to when Columbus or these other kind of great explorers, they were also exploring to new lands, to places never visited. And then, the capture of entire continents, the extraction of natural resources, our historical record as a human race is not very good. And I worry, and that's kind of the pro and con. Like you said, I've kind of researched it and I was like, okay, what kind of impact does, because I'm a big fan of Formula One, and you see a lot of the innovation and the tech that goes into Formula One come into actual commercial vehicles that you and I drive. So interestingly, insulin pumps were a result of were invented by NASA to monitor astronauts' health while in space.
Wasn't the domestic microwave as well?
Domestic microwave, Velcro. Yeah. Velcro is another annoying invention. Fluid-based dampers that were designed to protect the swing arms are what are used in buildings in Japan and earthquake-prone areas like San Francisco as seismic dampers. And then, of course, kind of embedded technologies within the spacecrafts, which are now kind of the basis of the Internet of Things, from home automation to sensors, building sensors, etc. So there are, I think, a lot of pros, but again, opportunity versus cost versus what is the end goal, right? If the end goal is to the betterment of the human race and to ensure continuity and a better life for all human beings across the planet, my kind of take on the space race is it's reserved. I think we're still quite far away, and as exciting as it is, it's also scary, just because kind of how we know when given the opportunity or the situation to go to explore a new land and to have access to new resources, how that doesn't necessarily always benefit everyone.
No, I think that's a fantastic point, and I think we're probably potentially a long way away from coming into another alien species, unless of course you're living in Roswell. But there is that to think about. I wonder if there should be some rules should there be rules about going into space? Why can an individual send up lots of different satellites into space? Who owns space? Who is the owner of that space above the Earth? Should it be governments? Is it the countries which pass under that space? How does it work? Who's actually controlling it? There's no rules. Nobody's actually stopping anybody from doing anything. You can send up any kind of vehicle up into space or satellite. Who actually controls all of this, and why would we give the power to a small few?
Yeah.
When we've got 8 billion people on this planet, we passed that 8 billion figure apparently the other day, according to some of the statistics I saw. 8 billion people on this planet, and maybe there's a few people who can sit in a room not much bigger than this who are actually the ones controlling everything that circles this planet, and of course goes beyond. I thought it was quite interesting that this, just to bring it back to the UAE and this fantastic rover that they're sending up. This has been the work in progress for 5 years, I believe. It started in 2017. I was thinking, how do you start this question? Who do you hire for building one of these rovers? And I was thinking probably the closest thing would be like a car or something that's engineered like a vehicle like that. That can kind of roam around, it'd be natural, right? And I was thinking, well, hold on. That when it comes to the Arab world, this whole peninsula and beyond, how many companies actually engineer cars here? And I was sort of looking it up, and we've got the UAE's got W Motors, which produces these super high-end, individual supercars. And then obviously we've had recently the Saudi Arabia's launched the electric vehicle brand Seer, which I think is super interesting. They want to create 30,000 jobs by 2034. They're licensing parts from BMW, so you kind of got that base to it, but then it's going to be built in the Arab world. Isn't that exciting from an engineering perspective? Yes, you've got this UAE rover. It's they're going to expand upon this, and it's potentially going to provide a lot of jobs in the UAE in the future as we expand into space. But I guess more on the near term, in Saudi Arabia, they're investing into electric vehicles, and those kind of two engineering things. You've got this pioneering stuff that the UAE is doing, going into space, and Saudi Arabia, perhaps reinventing something that's been around for a long time into something which can really empower jobs in the region. It's a super exciting time for engineering in the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah,
and that's what's really, really great about space exploration and these kind of initiatives and achievements, right? It's developing of industries, jobs, getting people trained, knowledge and academia, scientific research and development, product development. These are really, really exciting things, and I think that's what's really exciting about space exploration, and definitely kudos to the UAE, to really again. Kind of push in a direction and an industry where I also think, didn't they say it's like closer to the equator is better for to launch would they be called expeditions to space?
I don't know. I mean, I know that this particular one was launched from Cape Canaveral, famous. If you're going to launch something, let's launch it from Cape Canaveral, right? Yeah. So I believe that's where the launch was from. They're using SpaceX rockets to get the rover up into out of the atmosphere, and then the Japanese company iSpace had the lander. And then they used the lander to actually land on the moon's surface. And then this rover that's been produced within the UAE kind of goes out and spends, I believe, 2 days going around the environment. And they've designed it especially for extreme climates. And I thought, what better country? And it's right at the other end of the scale. It's super cold on the moon, on the dark side of the moon, if you like, to reference Pink Floyd, I think that is. But what better country to think about extremes of climate than the UAE? So I think as a part of the world that knows about controlling climate and being able to build things that are going to withstand those mighty extremes of temperature, I think the UAE is ideal for building rovers to the moon. In this part of the show, under the radar, we find nuggets of info from in the region and around the world. Perhaps it's something that hasn't been looked at too widely by mainstream media, or if it has been covered, maybe they haven't gone into too much detail and we can really kind of find some interesting things about it. And recently there's been some pretty big breakthroughs in nuclear fusion. A UK company called Pulsar Fusion has been awarded funding by the UK Space Agency. This is after they'd done some successful testing of electric propulsion engines. But the main goal of this business, and it's probably pretty obvious from the name Pulsar Fusion, they want to use nuclear fusion technology to power rockets through space. And they claim that this will help mankind escape the solar system. Very interesting opportunity for exploring nuclear fusion. So many different uses, whether it's energy on this planet, whether it's being able to explore other parts of the universe. What do you make of this in terms of the advantages or disadvantages of getting stuck into nuclear fusion?
I think it's interesting. It's going back to the earlier conversation we had about space. It's a technology that's being pushed to the limits, again, to achieve intergalactic travel, space travel, because cost of the engine and propulsion is kind of one of the biggest key factors in terms of how fast we progress there. But I think what's really interesting, specifically about this breakthrough, is the advancement within the technology of nuclear fusion and the impact that could have for our planet in terms of alternative energy sources, a move away from renewable energy. From what I understand, there's obviously a difference between nuclear fusion and nuclear fission.
Yeah, so fission, is what we kind of use at the moment in nuclear power stations, and we have a lot of waste that's obviously produced by that. Nuclear fusion is basically what's happening on the sun. So we're merging two heavy hydrogen atoms together, extreme amounts of heat and pressure, and from that it creates what obviously the sun does, which is vast amounts of energy. And this particular technology that's being uncovered at the moment, there's been some development as well. The National Ignition Facility, which is based at the US Department of Energy's...
That's the name of our next office, by the way.
National Ignition Facility, very nice. The US Department of Energy's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. They've been doing some work where they use magnetic fields, and they direct this at the kind of the plasmas that they're creating to increase the heat that it's producing. And what they found is that they can nearly get to the point where they can create that fusion ignition, and that's the kind of key point. If you can create that self-sustaining reaction, and you produce that it's quite interesting if you can get to that point, because that's where it really becomes technology where it could be used for energy in the future. And obviously we're in a part of the world here in the Arab world where we know everything about energy, right? Most of the countries here are reliant upon oil. So the actual movement towards that, and we've already seen it with countries around the region moving away from oil-based economies.
The Baraka power plant here in the UAE, yeah.
Absolutely, and it's there's that knowledge that energy is not always going to be powered by oil or fossil fuels. It is going to be moving towards nuclear, maybe renewable energy sources as well.
But I think another key point in that difference, just to further elaborate on the difference between fusion and fission, the kind of one of the key things, one point that you mentioned was the waste aspect, right? So the waste out of fusion is helium gas, inert, non-toxic, so that's really good. But I think one of the biggest things around, and the whole conversation around the past 50, 60 years around nuclear energy has been that it's not safe. There's an explosion, so Chernobyl, tsunami hit in Japan, radioactive waste, the fallout after that. This apparently is also a lot more safer since it's they're able to stop the process in case something goes wrong.
That's the fear, isn't it? That's always been the fear with nuclear technology, is you would have a moment where it would get out of control.
Yeah.
So the fact that they do have the ability to control it, as they say.
Yeah.
But then again, they don't know enough about it.
Yeah.
Do they? Can they definitely stop it, or are you going to create like a mini black hole by mistake?
Yeah.
Because you've done things in a slightly weird way with the lasers and all this kind of stuff that are being used to propel the reaction. And
then just going back to your second point about energy sources, right, and the global economy and trade and our increasing requirement of power now that we're 8 billion people across the world. The Europeans and the Americans were leaders within nuclear energy and production of the nuclear energy plants. And over the years, they started shutting them down or decommissioning them because of the move towards renewable energy sources, investments within wind, thermal, solar. And now, again, geopolitical tensions, and it kind of, again, let's juxtapose that to space, who owns it, fight for natural resources. Europe is facing challenges with regards to gas. So I think with regards to energy sources, I think there'll always need to be a balance. And I think that's something that the world should accept, that it's not either or. There should be a balance. And obviously countries with which don't have the level of technology and investment to be able to use such technologies such as solar, wind, nuclear, they still need to rely on fossil fuels to meet their energy requirements so that they can advance as, improve the living conditions for their populations, etc. I think that's very important. But this is very exciting. I think the key thing is, how will this kind of play out for the huge kind of energy debate that we're kind of facing? The world is feeling, real world people are feeling the impact of this energy. Unless you lived in India and you have to deal with the smog, or you're in China, for example, right? Or you're in a low-lying place. So, for example, Pakistan had devastating floods recently. So unless you're a direct victim of climate change, and now that for example, Europeans are feeling the pinch of rising energy bills.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really interesting. And I think the UAE is going to be at the center of this conversation with COP being hosted here. So this is going to be quite exciting, and I think it's going to be an interesting debate to keep an eye on.
Yeah, of course, COP was in Egypt recently as well, and now going into the UAE, and obviously it's part of a wider debate around energy, and renewable has to be part of that mix. And I think it's really important to invest in all areas so that we don't end up in a position where we're continuing to use fossil fuels to power things. And I think everybody can kind of agree on that. It's just how soon is it going to get there? It's going to be a while for nuclear fusion to get on that energy bandwagon. The Fusion Industry Association said that private equity investment in the industry has more than doubled in the past year. It's risen from $2.1 billion to $4.7 billion this year. So private businesses are trying to get in on this. And at some point, somebody's going to make an absolute fortune from nuclear fusion. The question is it going to be 5 years from now, 50 years from now, or 100? And I don't think anyone quite knows the real answer for that yet. And we're moving in that moment where oil-based economies know that they need to move away. They know that they need to move into other sources of energy and also other sources of revenue and GDP for their countries. And by the time that a lot of the space travel happens, the nuclear fusion happens, by the time that becomes a reality, what will the Middle East look like? And do we need 24/7 work in order to get there? So thanks for listening. This has been a duke+mir production.